This is Stand Up's Russia Week. Due to the Olympics in Sochi, we decided to do at least one segment a day on different aspects of the country, its history, and where it is now. To start off, we want to learn about a hugely important aspect of Russia's interesting history, communism. From 1922 to 1991, Russia was part of the Soviet Union, which was a communist state. To discuss communism in Russia, we go to the Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. He's the author of numerous books on Russia, including Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives from Stalinism to the New Cold War and The Victim's Return, Survivors of the Gulag After Stalin. He's lived in and often visits Moscow and was there most recently in December. We're very excited to have Professor Stephen Cohen, joining us now. What did I get wrong already factually, sir?
Everything's exactly right, except my old age.
We really appreciate you joining us on day one. I think we have to start by talking about two dates, 1917 and 1991, but I know in 15 minutes or so I can't do any of this justice, so I almost want you to lead me with what we really need to know about the creation of the Soviet Union and its dissolution. I know you don't like the word collapse in the 90s.
Pete, I'll tell you, what your listeners need to know, if they don't already, at the top, is that the subject of the Soviet Union, communism in Russia, if you want to call it that, is probably the single most controversial subject in 20th century history. In a way, if you think about it, not on the calendar, but in terms of political history, 20th century history began with the Russian Revolution in 1917, and it ended in 1991 with the end of the Soviet Union, because Soviet history, really more than any other, arguably, defined the 20th century. Most people think for worse, but that's a disputed question. Why and how all this happened? Among ideologues, of course, you have left and right. You get radically opposing views. But if you take four very good, highly informed, veteran scholars, professional historians of the period, you're probably going to get 4 points of view. So the only thing I can tell you is that what you're going to get from me is my point of view. Behind it stands 40 years of research and my effort to do the best I can. There are people who sort of agree with me, and there are people who radically disagree with me. But to give you the bookends, the rise of the Soviet Union grew out of one of the greatest, I don't mean good, but biggest and most profound revolutions of history, the Russian Revolution of 1917. It was a revolution from above. No political party actually controlled those events until the end of 1917, when the communists came to power. And Soviet history, though we call it communist, changed profoundly over its 70-plus years. The meaning, even the official meaning, but certainly the actual meaning of Soviet or Russian communism was very different in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1970s and 80s. And if we remember Gorbachev's effort between 1985 and 1991 to democratize the Soviet system and marketize it, that was a different kind of Soviet communism or Soviet history. And finally, when you get to the question of why the Soviet Union ended in December 1991, I have a chapter in my book, the one you mentioned, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives. One chapter sets out the different scholarly explanations of why the Soviet Union ended. And there are about 9 different and conflicting explanations. So you are entering a territory, a historical, political, interpretive territory, where there is very little agreement and a lot of heat, a lot of anger.
Well, Americans look at the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a triumph.
Yep.
How do Russians see it today?
Well, I mean, Russia's a big country. It's still the largest territorial country in the world, despite all the territory lost when the Soviet Union ended. It has 143 million people, about half of what it had when the Soviet Union existed. But that's a lot of people living in a lot of different territories, a lot of ethnic groups, about 15 to 20 million Russian citizens. It's a federation like the United States, I mean, at least constitutionally, with different equivalents of our states. About 15 to 20 million Russian citizens are Muslims. And Muslims don't think the way ethnic Russians think in Russia today, to give you one example. Generally speaking, though, opinion polls, which are taken 3 or 4 times a year in Russia by Russian and foreign agencies, tell us that about 55 to 60% of Russian citizens still, 22 years later, regret the end of the Soviet Union. Now, that's a full stop, because it doesn't mean they want it back. About 25 to 30% would like it back. But there's a kind of nostalgia. And after all, the Soviet Union lasted more than 70 years, which means that the majority of the people living in Russia today grew up under that system. They were educated, they played, they trained themselves for vacation, they had their first sexual relations, they fell in love, they raised their families, they retired, they buried their parents. I mean, you can't ask people to jump out of their history. So this yearning for, or nostalgia for, the Soviet Union is, what's the expression, biological, or biographical. It's nothing bad, it's nothing good, it's absolutely natural. But, and this may be the more important point, life in Russia has been so traumatic, particularly in the 1990s when the country plunged into a depression more corrosive than our Great Depression. That life has been so hard. So many people died prematurely. So many people, particularly middle-aged professional people, lost their jobs. So much inequality emerged with a handful of people controlling most of the wealth of the country and so many people falling into poverty. Much of that has been corrected by Putin, which is one reason he's popular. But given all that trauma, you even find among a lot of young people, though they don't know firsthand Soviet life, a kind of yearning for what the Soviet Union toward the end brought its people. And that was increasing prosperity, though nowhere near what we enjoyed, but what far more than their fathers or grandfathers had ever had. Stability and a status in the world that was that of a great power. Much of that has been lost, so people naturally look back, maybe through rose-tinted memory glasses, on the Soviet era as a positive era, about 55 to 60%. And that, by the way, influences the way Putin governs the country, because no leader who wants to be effective and last can govern against the majority sentiments, at least, even if Russians don't know exactly what they want. But a leader cannot set himself or herself against the sentiments of his people.
We're talking to Professor Frand Cohen of NYU, who is one of the foremost experts on the Soviet Union, its creation, its ending, Russia today. Of course, the Olympics in Sochi getting kicked off, and this is our Russia week, and so we're leading it off with one of the best. What about, let me go back to 1917. You said that that revolution started from the top. Usually revolutions start from the bottom up. Why did that happen?
No.
Why did the Russian Revolution, or is it the same term, Bolshevik Revolution, same thing?
The communists were called Bolsheviks before they changed their name to communists in 1918. So they're the same party, Lenin's party. Maybe I didn't make myself clear. A real revolution, and now I put on my professor's hat, always involves great numbers of people below in society. Always. So when a colonel in some small country pulls up to the presidential palace, aims a tank at the current president, drives that person from power, and announces that he, colonel, is now the president, that is not a revolution. That's a coup d'etat. A revolution involves millions and millions of people, and that's what happened in Russia in 1917. The Tsar, the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 400 years, collapsed in February 1917, largely, though not only because of, the pressures of World War I. which brought terrible economic, demographic, social suffering to Russia. And riots developed in the streets, bread riots, and the Tsar abdicated. And then you had, from February till October, when the Bolsheviks took power, a period of democracy and voting and chaos. But during those months, peasants began to take the land from landlords that they believed they were entitled to. Workers began to seize the factories from factory owners who didn't treat them fairly. And above all, soldiers, who were mainly peasant soldiers, mobilized and armed to fight World War I, turned against their officers, and as Lenin said, voted with their feet. They deserted the front, which was brutal in World War I. They went back to their home villages, now with their guns, and they too began to take land. So by October, when the Bolsheviks took power, or really occupied the governmental offices in Moscow, because there was little power left in the capital, in St. Petersburg, Petrograd, the country was in revolutionary turmoil. And what followed, as one would have expected at that time, was a 4-year civil war from about 1917 to 1921, when the communists, Lenin's party, consolidated its power. So that whole period, from 1917 to 1921, is best viewed as the revolution. And it involved, as it did in the French Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, millions of people, a collapsed ruling class, civil war, and eventually the most determined or able or popular, there's a dispute about this, political party taking power in the capital, and then facing the problem of how to rebuild and govern a country divided and devastated by revolution and civil war. And of course, the communists said that they were going to rebuild Russia as a socialist system, which would become communist. And that's the next approximately 70 years of Soviet history.
Like I said, it's tough to have a short amount of time with an expert like you and know what questions to ask and what high points to hit. But I've always been curious, growing up in America in the 80s with Reagan as president and the negotiations with Gorbachev over nuclear weapons and so on, and what we learned and what we were taught, and then, frankly, what your generation was taught, my father's generation. What did Russians think of Americans? What, during the height of the Cold War, we know what we were taught to believe about communist Russia and Russians. What were they taught to believe about us?
Well, it varied from period to period. Under Stalin, after World War II, when the long Cold War, which lasted at least from about 1946 until the Gorbachev-Reagan period, because Gorbachev and Reagan said they had ended the Cold War. I'm not sure they did, but they thought they had. So let's take them at their word for now. But during the harshest period of the Cold War, Russian citizens, Soviet citizens, were taught that the United States, the citadel of imperialism and capitalism, was the source of evil, and that evil included an attempt to destroy the Soviet system. Now, that softened under Khrushchev when we entered the period of détente, first under Khrushchev and Eisenhower, then under Brezhnev and Nixon, and particularly, you recall, Reagan, who was our most, at least rhetorically, Cold War president, when he embraced Gorbachev, and they became partners in trying to end the nuclear arms race. At that point, the whole perception, particularly under Gorbachev, of what America was changed fundamentally. The official line is that America was now the Soviet Union's partner, or soon would be. So there's been varying official views, but here's what's interesting, Pete. I lived in Moscow many years between the late 70s and the end of the Soviet Union. I met people who believed the official propaganda that the United States system, at least, not the American people, because the government always said the people were Mark Twain and Jack London and all, that the American people were good, but that they had an evil government. I met people, young people, old people, official, unofficial, who believed that. But in private, when we sat down to talk, I don't recall meeting a person who had more dislike for America than he or she did admiration for America. This is during the Cold War. That is different today in Russia and a separate subject, because in Russia today, there are many, many people, whether they're told this by their Russian government today or not, who believe firmly that since the end of the Soviet Union, the United States has treated Russia very, very badly, and they resent it. So anti-Americanism, which was a kind of it was artificial, half believed, half disbelieved during the Soviet era, has become an authentic political force in Russia today. And that's a kind of tragedy.
What is something that you enjoyed while living in Russia culturally?
You know, a Russian newspaper asked me this question about 5 months ago. I did an interview with them. They said, what do you remember fondly about living in the Soviet era?
27 Questions with Stephen Cohen.
You saw that, yeah. Thank you.
It's fascinating.
It's on the Nation website in English. We translated it into English.
Yeah.
But what I remember most of all was the personal friendships, the warmth of those personal friendships in what was a rather cold system. People huddled together to support each other, to befriend each other, to share private views that couldn't be expressed in the censored press. And I remember night after night after night after night, month after month, year after year, sitting in people's kitchens because the apartments were small and this is where social life took place, and having conversations that I miss today and that I really never experienced in America because we say pretty much whatever we want in public and nobody listens. But in Russia, it was very different. Now, maybe my memory is clouded by the fact that I was a bit clouded by too much vodka in those days. But those personal relationships during the Soviet era is what I remember very fondly, and it's what apparently most educated people, professional people in Russia today also remember fondly about the Soviet era.
What?
It's a very personal thing. Of course, for the majority of the people, bear in mind that until the Khrushchev era, the late 50s and early 60s, Russia really had no social security welfare system. It was on paper, but it wasn't funded. And it grew eventually, the Soviet state did, after Stalin's death in 1953, into the largest welfare state in the world, a kind of cradle to grave, the state will take care of you. It wasn't high quality. It had mean aspects to it. The trade-off was you kept your mouth shut in public. But nonetheless, it gave people a personal security that was very important to them. I think that if you said that to many Americans today who have lost so much security during the Great Recession of the last 6 or 7 years, they may not sympathize with the Soviet experience, but they would understand that human reaction to it. Because if you make parents, children healthy, if you educate those children and you give them a profession, parents everywhere in the world are going to value that very highly, and possibly above all else, including political freedom.
That seems like a more controversial statement, though, that only because you said if you give them, right? Some people might say you have to earn it.
That's right. There is a different, how shall we say it, political, cultural difference. Most Russians, even today, look to the state to provide subsidized welfare provisions, free education, and a guaranteed job. By the way, even though Russia claims it's a capitalist state today, Russia under Putin, those provisions are written in the Russian Constitution. Free education and a guaranteed job. That predated communism. If you want to be historical, this goes back to a Russian tradition that placed a very high premium on social justice and the state taking care of people. Now, the state abused a lot of people along the way, but we're not talking about what the state believes, the elites believe. We're talking about what people believe, ordinary people. And that remains a Russian tradition. We, on the other hand, in the United States, have grown up being taught that individualism is what gets you ahead. And don't look to the government or the state to do things for you. But remember, Pete, we're debating that very issue today. That's at the core of the debate between left and right, the Tea Party and liberals today in America. How much should the American government do to give the American people security and opportunity? And some people say as little as possible, because it's of no value if people don't achieve it on its own. And the other side says, no, the government is obliged to do this for people who can't do it for themselves. And with that in mind, we go and vote. But for Russians, this really isn't a contested issue. They expect their state to do certain things at a minimum for them.
Fair to say.
When the government does it, it expects in return loyalty from the people.
All right. I have so many follow-ups. I have 3 more big questions, but I've taken up so much of your time. So how much time do I have?
I don't mind, Pete. Go ahead.
What is religion's role in modern-day Russia? What was religion's role from 1917 till now? Because obviously my ignorance is tremendous on the issue, on the country, on its history, like most issues that we talk about here, hence the appeal of the show. But I just assumed anyone who was anti-gay, it came from a religious point of view. It's not, however, the case in Russia. I've learned.
Oh, now wait a minute. You've flung up several good questions. The status of religion in Russia, and then how that might relate to tolerance or a lack of tolerance for gay people. If we start at the first, very briefly, with the first question, before the revolution, Russia was what Russians call a multi-confessional state. That is, it had several very large popular religions that coexisted in Russia. Russian Orthodox, the Jewish religion, Muslims, and others. That is still the reality of Russia today, with, of course, Russian Orthodoxy being the majority religion. Before the revolution, it was virtually an official part of the Russian political system. You were supposed to express loyalty and faith to the Russian Tsar and to the head of the Russian Church. After the revolution, the communists who believed in atheism waged various campaigns to rid Russia of religiosity. Sometimes the campaigns were merely educational. Sometimes it involved executing priests and Jews and others. By the late Soviet period, the government's position on religion was a sort of don't ask, don't tell policy. There were a lot of churches in Russia, not many synagogues, but a lot of churches. Russians went to church if they wanted. They didn't go to church if they didn't want. Nobody was much persecuted for this. The reality seemed to have been that there were quite a few private believers, worshipers, who didn't go to church, but the majority of the country was not religious any longer. In recent years, first under Yeltsin, but particularly under Putin, 2 things very important have happened. Well, one very important, one very interesting. The Russian Orthodox Church has again become a major and a conservative force in Russian politics, in a tacit alliance with the Kremlin. Putin goes to church, he's seen with the top leaders of the church defends Putin's policy. The other thing that's happened is that Russian Jews have fared better under Putin than under, I think this is correct to say, that under any Russian leader in history. And that in addition, Putin's relations with Israel are better than have been any Russian government's relations with Israel in history. So if you're just doing these evaluations in a kind of Jewish way, like how are Jews doing in Russia today, The answer is really quite good, comparatively. And does Russia threaten Israel? And the answer to that is no. And there are reasons for this. There are so many Russian immigrants in Israel. Things have changed. The real divide in Russia today is the Islamic population, because there are 15 or 20 million of them, because of the rise of jihadism, because of the decline of secular Islamic beliefs in Russia since the end of the Soviet Union. This is the real issue, the real problem in Russia today, at least in terms of religion. Now, if you want to go to the issue of homosexuality and the degree to which it's tolerated or not tolerated in Russia, the short story is that for many, many years, homosexuality was a crime in the Soviet Union, and homosexuals were treated very, very badly. Toward the end, not officially, but in reality, it became a kind of, again, don't ask, don't tell. If you were gay and you kept your lifestyle private, you went about your public and private business on different levels, you could manage. Under Yeltsin, I think it was 1993, but it might have been 1994, homosexuality was decriminalized in Russia. It was no longer a crime. But you can't change people's attitudes just by changing the law. So now we have this issue in the forefront because of the law passed in the parliament, Russian parliament, and signed by Putin, banning what they call propagandizing homosexual relations anywhere where children may see it. By the way, there was an article in the Washington Post on, I think it was February 3rd, by two, I think, law professors at Yale, documenting that there are quite a few American states who have the same law and even more harsh versions of it. So what Russia passed was not unusual. Whether it's bad or it's good, it's not unusual. But you ask about how people feel about it. Again, we have some public opinion polls in Russia on this very question you ask. Roughly, because opinion changes depending on how the questions are asked and when the poll is done. Roughly 80% of Russian citizens today, according to polls, believe that being gay, homosexuality, is either a disease or a choice. That is, they believe it's not natural, about 80%. Therefore, the government's law banning homosexual propaganda or showing the lifestyle before children is popular and accepted. And that sounds horrible because we are enlightened people. But I'm old enough to remember the time in America when overwhelmingly this is what Americans also believed. We've come a long way. And we came that way through enlightenment, through the struggle by gay people for their rights in this country. And that's a process that Russia will either go through or not go through within Russia and on its own terms. Partly these views come from religious views, but I think mostly they come from traditional conservative views that are also Western European. Look at the marches in France today against the proposal to legalize gay marriage. Many French people, whom we always think are very enlightened about sexual matters, are against it, a very large number. These traditional, what used to be called Judeo-Christian values, which put at the center of morality and social stability the traditional family, these values remain the majority values in much of the world. And they may be the majority value in the United States. I don't know, because we've become so politically correct, we're not prepared to tell anybody we think otherwise. But certainly in Russia, it is absolutely clear that the overwhelming of majority people believe in the exclusivity of the traditional family and its values. And if that's going to change, the change can't be brought about by Americans or Western gays. It's got to come from within Russia.
Finally, Stephen Cohen, I read...
It changed in the United States.
What's that? What'd you say?
I said the struggle for that. If you and I believe that gays should have the same rights that everyone has. Freedom to express themselves, freedom to marry, all the protections of American law. If we believe that, we can wish it for Russia, but only Russians can achieve it. And I would take it a step farther if you want to be a bit controversial. I believe that all this American clamoring about gays and the Sochi Olympics is doing Russian gays more harm than good, because they already have one stigma in Russia, being gay. Now they're being stigmatized as American agents, in addition. And when I was in Moscow in December and saw a few of my gay friends, this subject came up, and that was certainly their personal view, that the United States should close its mouth about this. It can deplore something, but to turn it into a way of tainting or undermining the Sochi Olympics, in which Russians are taking great pride, has a backlash, a negative effect inside Russia, among most people. Not all people, of course, but most.
You mentioned the great pride, Stephen Cohen, of the Russians have for having the Olympics, but I read a Russian expert recently, or maybe it was the New Republic, Julia, what's her name, Olaf?
Julia Jaffe.
Yeah, somebody suggested that maybe Vladimir Putin is having some regrets about hosting the Olympics, what with the terrorist threats and the attacks that have occurred. Why would you want the Olympics if you're Russia? Was this a mistake?
Well, first of all, every significant country in the world, large country in the world, wants the Summer or Winter Olympics, and there's a competition for it. And Putin went to the International Olympic Committee, what was it, 7 or 8 years ago, and made a bid for the Winter Olympics. By the way, he's also going to host the World Cup a few months later. And the committee thought what he was proposing was great, and they gave it to him. China had it. It doesn't hinge on being what we call a democratic country. It's supposed to be a country that can put on a really good Olympics, and Putin committed a lot of money. And they have spent a lot of money on the Olympics, not as much as this $50 billion as being bannered about, because a lot of that money went for the infrastructure of Sochi itself. It's supposed to be there after the Olympics are gone. Does Putin regret it? Well, I mean, I don't think he expected 7 or 8 years ago that you would get what I regard as a really scurrilous Western media assault on his Olympics. He was worried, of course, about having enough snow in a tropical climate to have the ski events. And he was worried about the terrorists, who were centered about 400 miles from Sochi in the Caucasus. He was worried about all this. And, of course, he was worried about whether Russia, which has a significant level of corruption and a significant lack of work ethic, could get this done. But I don't think he anticipated what is really a concerted attack on the Sochi Olympics, because so much of the American media just plain hates Putin. I read 2 articles in the Washington Post, one in the sports page, one on the editorial page, just in the last couple of weeks, about Putin's Olympics, that said that it's really just come down to a struggle between Putin and the terrorists. And when they describe Putin in these articles, I could see how a reader, and I say this half-jokingly, might put down those articles and wonder, am I supposed to cheer for Putin or the terrorists? Because there's such a longing, particularly in the American media, that these Olympics fail, so that Putin fails, that I think is no longer becoming, that it's become obscene. It's a kind of pornography. There are a lot of problems. There may be a terrorist attack. There may not be. But these Olympic Games are very important to Putin, to Russia, but of course to the whole world, because these are the Olympics. It's too bad that the Olympics have become so politicized, but that happened decades and decades and decades ago. But I don't think in history, unless we go back to the Hitler's Olympics, when was it, 1936? And probably not even then, because Hitler wasn't yet widely hated. I don't think there's been an Olympics in modern history where so much spiteful invective has been directed at the leader of the country that's hosting the Olympics, and therefore at the games themselves. And I have to say that I feel very sorry for all the athletes around the world, including the American ones, who have trained for years and years for a wonderful competition, and now have to go there in this atmosphere of spite and hatred and even fear. It's not a good thing, and you can't blame Putin alone for all of this.
Stephen Cohen, what a fascinating conversation. I cannot thank you enough. Clearly, we have to have a discussion about Vladimir Putin, the man and the country under his leadership. But before we go, apparently you are opposed to using Twitter. Is this right?
No, I'm not opposed to it. I live with a woman.
Who has 100,000 Twitter followers.
Well, but you have to understand that I no longer have a social life with her. She just sits home and, what is it called, tweet or twitters? I don't do it. I mean, I live among archive documents. Twitter for me would be a distraction. I've only been on email for about a year and a half,
Wow.
And that's plenty for me.
Best vodka in the world?
Oh, that's a complicated question. So, to show you how uninformed people can be, when the law signed by Putin, which people regard as anti-gay, was passed, the gay community organized a boycott of Stolichnaya vodka because they thought it was a Russian government-owned vodka. In fact, I believe it's produced in Finland and no longer owned by Russians. So the best vodka in the world, let me put it to you like this. If you like real vodka, actual traditional vodka, best consumed after it's been in the freezer for 24 hours. Not with ice, but just frozen in the freezer. There's nothing better than Russian vodka. If you like vodka that you can mix, and it's a soft, gin-like vodka, then you buy all these boutique vodkas like Grey Goose, and they cost twice as much.
What's your favorite drink?
I like Stolichnaya because it's still produced on the traditional Russian formula, and a recent Russian vodka that's very similar and a little less expensive called Russian Standard. But that's an advertisement for which I've received no money.
How do you drink it?
I leave it. The bottles are always kept in the freezer, and when I feel like some vodka, I just pour it in a glass and I drink it. And I don't consume much, no more than one a day, but that's my drink of preference.
We learned a lot. I can't thank you enough for your time.
Here's what you didn't know. For me, at least, if you have a jumpy stomach, not a real sick stomach, but just your stomach doesn't seem quite right, a shot of vodka, iced Russian vodka, and a small piece of dark bread seems to take care of it right away.
The only time I ever threw up from drinking alcohol was from drinking vodka. To be fair to vodka, I drank it out of a Yankees souvenir cup, which is very large.
Well, the only time I ever got vomiting from drinking alcohol was rum, and I haven't had any since, and that was about 35 or 40 years ago.
So perhaps you'll revisit rum, and I will revisit vodka. I think that's what we learned.
I'm staying away from the rum.
Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.